Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. I have a very special story here for you, and this is something that is very different from anything I've ever written before, but I feel very proud of this work, and I hope you will enjoy it as well. So boil yourself some tea, turn down the lights, get cozy, and settle in for the Lone Wolf Holiday Special. My name is Elliot. My last name's not important. A man of my stature and profession can't risk tarnishing that reputation with the story that I'm about to tell you. All of this happened last Christmas Eve, and as I sit here now, writing the story out, I look back at that fateful day and wonder how much different my life would be right now if things hadn't happened the way that they did. Christmas Eve, 1 year ago. I was just leaving my office for the day, and even though it was only 3:30 in the afternoon, the sun had already begun to slip behind the horizon. The town I live in is almost on the time zone boundary line, and it gets dark here really early in the winter. Since it was already pretty early and I had no other place to be, I decided to go ahead and get some coffee at a coffee shop that was still open around the corner before heading home. When I had become financially able to do so, I had relocated my entire business and home to a small town, far outside the big city I had lived in my entire life. When I was a kid, my parents and I would go on long weekend trips into the countryside to see my grandparents for the holidays. They lived in a small town, much like this one, and those memories are some of the fondest that I have from my childhood. It snows a lot here, especially in the wintertime, and we spent more than one extra weekend trapped in my grandparents' house while my dad and grandpa would dig their cars out of the snow an inch at a time. I had longed for that sense of wonder and joy that had been missing in my life for some time, and thought that if I had recreated the environment in my everyday life, that it would just come flooding back to me. But thus far, I hadn't felt anything. I turned the corner and started heading down the street that led from my office building to the town square, where the coffee shop was located. It was bitterly cold outside that day, even for late December, and my expensive name brand winter coat wasn't providing me with much warmth or comfort. I had also left my gloves and my desk back in the office, and so my bare hands were now exposed to the lethally cold air. I picked up my pace into a brisk walk, and eager to get to the coffee shop and soak up some of that heat before it closed. I passed a bus stop that was located on the corner of the street I was on in the town square. I noticed someone standing there and almost looked away instinctively when something about them caught my attention. It was a young woman, probably in her late 20s or so, roughly around my age. She was sitting on the bench with her back to me, so I couldn't see much of her face. She had auburn hair that was half tied around her head into a ponytail. She appeared to be staring off into the distance, towards the town square. There had been a musical Christmas festival of some sort in the square earlier that day, but the frigid cold and dissipating sun had ended the festivities earlier than normal. So now there were just a few scattered people left, gathering up tables and trash. As I looked back at the woman, I finally saw what had attracted my attention to her in the first place. She was just wearing a light jacket and appeared to be wearing either a skirt or shorts, because I could see the bottom portion of her bare legs. I also saw that she was wearing some flip-flops instead of shoes. The strangest part of this whole sight was that she didn't appear to be bothered by the cold at all. She wasn't shivering, she wasn't huddling or rubbing her arms for warmth, and most bizarrely, I couldn't see her breath in the cold air. This last part unnerved me deeply. Even if she wasn't bothered by the cold temperatures, surely her breath would still be visible in the air. Unless, I thought, she wasn't breathing at all. The thought gave me a brief moment of panic, and I decided I had to go over and check on the woman, just to make sure she was alright. I walked over to the bus stop and around to the front of the bench where she was sitting. She didn't look up at me or even acknowledge my presence. She was indeed staring ahead at the town square. She was dressed in khaki capri pants that stopped just below her knees, and a gray hoodie over top a blue polo shirt. She was also wearing these big frame glasses. I looked at her for a few moments before speaking up. "Excuse me, are you okay? You've got to be freezing out here," I said, my words occasionally getting caught in my near-frozen mouth. The air was almost piercing in how cold it was. She didn't respond to me at all. I thought maybe she was deaf and couldn't hear me, so I moved closer to her and more into her line of sight. "Hello? Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" She finally looked up at me with the most confused expression I had ever seen. Her eyes bugged out so much that I thought they were going to fall out for a second. Her mouth gaped open and her whole expression just froze. This entire situation was genuinely starting to freak me out, and her reaction to my being there was only making things worse. We stayed like that for a few moments, just staring at each other, before she finally said something. And what she said made my blood run even colder. "You can see me?" she said in a soft, almost angelic whisper. Her voice was so delicate, and she spoke with such an almost melancholic longing in her voice, as if she had waited her entire life to see me. I was taken back by what she said, and was about to respond, when in that same second it all came flooding back to me. This had happened before, a long time ago. I almost lost my balance as I became weak at the knees at the rush of memories that were all coming back to me at once. It all started years ago, a week after the last Christmas my family and I would spend at my grandparents' house. One of the worst blizzards in state history had just blown over town and buried us all under 4 feet of snow. My grandpa had managed to get his truck out of the driveway and drove into town to pick up some supplies. But he never came back. We stayed up all night waiting for him, but my grandpa never came back to us. The next morning we learned from the police who came to our door that his truck had slid off the road down an embankment. My grandpa died upon impact. My entire family was devastated, while I had a somewhat muted reaction myself. I've never gotten choked up or teary-eyed when someone passes away. I understood from a very young age that death is a simple part of life, and I've always felt that a person is never truly entirely gone, even when they die. Still though, my grandpa's death hit us all pretty hard, and my whole family and I spent the next few weeks in a near constant state of silent mourning, except my mother, who cried herself to sleep every night in her grief. She had always been close to her parents, and her father's sudden death had a profound effect on her. A week after his death, my grandpa was laid to rest, with much of the town still buried in snow, so there wasn't very many people able to attend. We began driving back to my grandparents' house to pack up and get ready to leave in the morning. My parents had to get back to work, and my winter break from school was almost over, but nobody was ready to leave my grandmother there all alone by herself. I was sitting in the back seat of the car, staring out the window. My parents were in the front seat, and the radio was on, but nobody was really saying anything. And even with the radio on, the silence inside of the car was almost deafening. The sun had long since set, and it was pitch black outside now. Since we were far enough away from the city, the sky was ablaze with the twinkling light of 1,000 stars. As a kid, I would gaze up at the sky every time I'd come visit my grandparents, and I always wished I could have that view outside every night and see those same stars back at home. We were on a long stretch of road that twisted through the hills and dense patches of forest, so there were very few cars on the road. I could feel my little 11-year-old eyes growing heavier by the minute, and was just about to fall asleep when I noticed something in the passenger seat next to me. I looked over and froze completely. It was my grandpa, sitting right next to me and wearing the same clothes he had been wearing the day he died. I could even still smell the peach tobacco he had been smoking out of his pipe on the front porch before he left. He looked down at me with a very serious and stern look in his eyes. I blinked rapidly, telling myself I had to be asleep and this had to be a dream. But no, I was definitely awake. I wanted to scream or shout or do something to alert my parents in some way, but I was too transfixed on my grandpa. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How was he here? Why was he here? As if he could read my panic in my eyes and the thoughts in my head, he spoke to me. "Tell your dad to stop the car." he said in that deep, commanding voice I only ever heard when my grandpa was being deadly serious. His words hadn't quite registered to me, as I was still in a state of shock of seeing him in the back seat of our car when we had just left his funeral just 15 minutes ago. Seeing my confusion, he spoke up again, slightly louder this time, which emphasized how deep his voice really was. "Tell your dad to stop the car now." It finally broke me from my trance, and I turned to my dad, who was sitting right in front of me. "Dad, stop the car now," I said, almost spitting out my words in shock. "Why, what's the matter?" my dad asked, concern in his voice. "I don't know, Dad, just stop the car," I told my dad, getting more panicked by the second. My grandpa was still staring at me, now with his own look of panic and worry. "If you have to use the restroom, we're almost there, okay? Can you hold it for a few more minutes?" my dad asked reassuringly. I looked back at my grandpa, who looked stern and serious again. "You're almost out of time. Tell him to stop now, or something bad is going to happen." "Do it, Elliot," my grandpa warned. Now I was legitimately scared. My grandpa sounded so concerned and so serious at the same time. "Dad, please stop the car right now. Please, Dad. Grandpa said something bad is going to happen if you don't. Please stop the car." I began screaming as loud as I could. This finally got my dad's attention, and he put the brakes on and pulled over to the side of the road. Both my mom and dad looked at me, puzzled by what I had just said and my uncontrollable sobbing. My mom looked me right in the eyes and asked me to repeat what I had just said. I told them Grandpa was in the seat right next to me, and he'd said something bad was going to happen if we didn't stop the car. I noticed at this point they didn't appear to see my grandpa in the back seat with me, and when I looked over, he was gone. I tried blinking my eyes in vain, but there was no trace that he had ever even been there. "Grandpa, he was just right here. He was sitting right next to me. I swear, Mom, he was just here," I pleaded, but my dad already had this smug smirk on his face, probably telling himself I had imagined the whole thing. My mom looked more worried, though, and the expression she had on her face told me that she believed every word of what I had just said. My dad was just about to put the car back into drive when a loud cracking noise caught all of our attention. The sound was coming from up the road. My dad turned the high beams on, and we managed to catch the last part of a large tree slamming into the road ahead, ice smashing and spreading out all over the pavement. There was another moment of deafening silence in the car as we all stared ahead at the splintered tree that now blocked our path. I noticed my parents turn their heads and look back at me, but I was still staring ahead at the tree. If my dad had not stopped the car, we would be right where the tree had just fallen now. It could have very well have hit us and crushed the car like a can of tomatoes. Somehow my grandpa had known and warned me right before it happened. I didn't understand how any of this was possible. My dad did a turnabout and went down another street to get to my grandma's house. We didn't talk the whole rest of the way there, and we all went to bed that night without acknowledging what had just happened. We said our goodbyes to Grandma on the next morning, promising to see her and visit her again soon. We left the house and headed back to the city afterwards. We wouldn't be visiting my grandmother again, as she passed away just a few months later. Figured she just couldn't stand to live without my grandpa and gave up trying after he died. My mom was inconsolable for months afterwards. When we came back into town for the funeral, I saw my grandpa again, this time at the graveyard where he and my grandma were being buried together. It was warm enough outside to have a traditional service, and a great deal more people had been able to show up this time. My grandma's casket was being lowered into the ground when I looked up and saw them, both my grandpa and grandma, standing right next to each other. They were several rows away from the rest of us, but I could see them clear as day. They were smiling, and once they had noticed I had looked up, both my grandpa and grandma waved at me and smiled even bigger. My grandpa gave me a small wink, and he and my grandma turned around and began walking back through the rows of headstones and monuments. I noticed that there were several other people scattered around the cemetery, people who didn't appear to belong to our group, or any group at all. There was a guy in the far back rows next to the forest that lay along one edge of the cemetery. He appeared to be wandering aimlessly among the rows, not really paying attention to anything. He was wearing what I considered at the time to be a very funny-looking suit that, looking back on this now, was just really old-fashioned and out of date. He appeared to notice me as he looked over, and gave a half-hearted wave and smile before carrying on with his business. I noticed someone else, a young girl who looked like a teenager, that was much closer to us than the man. She was wearing a yellow sundress and a blue coat that appeared to be made out of denim. She was bending over to pick up a freshly sprouted flower from the ground when she looked up and looked straight at me. Her eyes grew bigger and she ran off as soon as she saw me. I saw one more person, this time an older woman, who was staring straight at me from a few rows behind my mom and dad. She had this red shawl on around her shoulders and she was wearing this tattered dress that went all the way down to the ground. She didn't look happy or scared to see me, she just stared at me, her mouth twisting into some sort of hungry-looking grin, like she was ready to eat me. I was getting very unnerved by all of this. I nudged my mom, who was sitting right next to me, and asked her if she could see any of the people I was seeing. The little girl in the yellow dress, the man in the funny suit, the old woman with the scary grin. My mom told me she couldn't see any of them. I began to seize up and started breathing heavily. I was too overwhelmed by what was happening, and I just needed to get away from here. I got up and bolted away from the others. I heard a few gasps and concerned voices speak up, as well as my mom and dad calling out my name, but I was already halfway to the cars by the time they finally started coming after me. I ran as fast as I could until I slammed into the family car, clawing at the door trying to get in. My parents came up behind me, and I almost swung around and hit them both in fright. My mom held my shoulders and asked me what was wrong. I couldn't say anything other than I just wanted to go home and that the cemetery was creeping me out. My mom looked at my dad, who was at a loss for words. She told my dad that she would stay here with me and asked him to go back to the others and tell them that we were leaving. He agreed and began walking back to the group. My mom unlocked the car and I got into the back seat. I expected her to get into the front passenger seat, but to my surprise, she climbed in behind with me. She looked at me with the same deadly serious face my grandpa had given in the car months ago. She asked me if I was alright, to which I said I was. She asked me what had scared me, and I didn't answer at first. She asked me again, and I said I didn't know, that I was just freaked out and I wanted to leave. My mom paused and then asked me if it was the people that I told her about that scared me. I froze up, too scared to say anything else. I was sure my mom was about to chasten me for having imaginary friends or making the whole thing up like my dad surely would have. But when I didn't say anything back, she spoke up and told me to not be afraid, that she believed me. I stared at her, amazed and confused by what she was saying. She told me that my grandpa had the same affliction, as she called it, and could see ghosts of people who were no longer with us as well. He used to tell her stories about talking to his dead relatives and people in the cemetery when he was a kid himself. My grandma never knew about any of this though, and my grandpa had kept this a secret from almost everyone he knew, besides my mom and God, my mom explained. My mom told me that I didn't need to be afraid of this gift I had, that the ghosts couldn't hurt me. She told me that I needed to keep it a secret from everyone else though. She explained to me that there were people out there that wouldn't understand it and would make fun of me or try to hurt me if they knew about my affliction. No sooner had my mom finished that sentence when my dad opened the driver's side door and got inside the car. He looked back at us and asked me if I was okay. I looked up at Mom, who was now feigning a look of concern and confusion. I played along and said I was okay now, that the cemetery had just made me sad about Grandma and Grandpa. My dad looked at me and reached out his hand to pat my knee affectionately. My mom leaned in and gave me a hug, then got out of the car and joined my dad up front. Later that night, when we were all back home and getting ready for bed, my mom came in to kiss me goodnight and tuck me in. As she did, she leaned in and whispered into my ear that if I ever saw someone that I didn't want to see, my grandpa had told her that if you close your eyes and tell them to go away 3 times, that they would. I looked up at my mom and smiled, thanking her for listening and for believing in me. My mom didn't respond, she just smiled at me and blew me a kiss goodnight before leaving. Over the next few years, I tried to take my mother's advice to heart. Ever since my grandpa first appeared to me, I had started to see other people that no one else seemingly couldn't. Most of them appeared to know that I could see them as well, and would try to talk to me or approach me in some way. Like I would do any normal stranger, I ignored them and walked away. When they would follow me or persist afterwards, I would close my eyes and tell them to go away. And to my astonishment, they disappeared immediately. I learned how to start blocking them out eventually. Blinking and telling them to go away became second nature. The memories of my grandpa and what had happened in the cemetery had begun to fade away into the recesses of my mind. as did my gift to see people beyond this world. I never tried to understand my gift or learn more about it, or anyone else who claimed to have had it too. I didn't want to. I wanted to live my life as normal as possible. As grateful as I was to my grandpa for saving my life, the thought of him or any other spirit returning to me like that scared me too much. And so I tried to will my powers and those memories away from me. And it worked. I stopped seeing ghosts only a few years after that incident, and eventually forgot all about it. For 20 years. Until last year, when I saw that woman at the bus stop. As soon as she spoke to me, I knew exactly what was happening, and I nearly blacked out from the shock. The woman must have noticed the fear in my eyes because her expression changed to worry, and she stood up to fully face me. "Please, don't be scared. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. You're just the first person who's been able to see me in ages," she pleaded with me, the desperation thick in her voice. I stumbled back a few steps, trying to get my balance. This was such a blow to the chest, and I was having trouble keeping myself grounded. This had to be a dream, I thought to myself. I fell asleep at the office, and now I'm having a fever dream. I thought about what my mother had taught me, and was about to close my eyes when I thought of the woman, how she pleaded with me, and how sad and desperate she had sounded. I looked at her for a moment before speaking. "This is real, isn't it? You're not some sort of drug-induced hallucination I'm having, right?" I asked, hoping deep down that she would say yes. I walked up to her and touched her shoulder. Yep, she was there all right. "This can't be happening. This can't be happening," I repeated to myself. I had just been walking down the street on my way to get some coffee, and now here I was in the middle of a full-blown existential crisis. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, then counted to 10. I opened my eyes and looked at the woman, who was still staring at me with a look of sadness in her eyes. I spoke to her again. "You said I'm the first person who's been able to see you?" "Yeah, you are," she responded back. "So I guess that means you're dead. You're a ghost, aren't you?" I asked. "If that's what you want to call it, then yeah, I guess so," she retorted back, the sadness in her voice quickly replaced with a sarcastic wit. I sat down on the long bench and put my hands through my hair, fighting back an incoming headache. There was too much swirling around in my head right now, and I couldn't deal with any of it. I felt like I was about to both scream and break down in tears at the same time. I looked back over at the woman who had sat down next to me. "What's your name?" I asked. "Harper," she replied, the fear and sadness now fully leaving her eyes. Despite the cold, I pressed on. I had never had a conversation with any of the ghosts I'd seen in my life, and I felt like there was a reason I was seeing and talking to this one in particular. A part of me wanted to know her story. What had happened that had led her to this current state that she was in? She told me that she had died right there, at that bus stop just 6 months ago. That was shortly before I had moved to town, and I hadn't heard about the accident. Harper told me she was stepping off the curb to cross the street when a drunk driver had turned the corner and ran her over. She died almost immediately. I hung on her every word. It was giving me a kind of thrill, communicating with somebody who's passed away, who wasn't really there. For years I had been afraid of my gift and had tried to suppress it, but I was high on adrenaline as I spoke to the spirit next to me as if I were talking to any other human being. "So are you trapped here?" I asked. "No, I'm not trapped. I've been all over town since I died, and I could go anywhere if I wanted to. But I keep finding myself here time and time again. I loved walking around here when I was a kid, especially around this time of year. The lights and displays in the stores looked so pretty I could stare at them for hours." She was looking back at the square, which was now completely bare of people. The lights from the towering Christmas tree twinkled in the dimming sunlight. This entire moment was so surreal, so larger than life. I don't know if I'm making any sense right now. I'm doing my best to describe my state of mind during this moment, but it's hard to articulate. The rest of the world just seemed to fade away around me. All I knew and all I was focused on was Harper, and the story that she was telling me. She told me about her childhood, how her dad had ran out on her mom and her sister when she was very young, how her mom had struggled most of their lives to provide for them. Christmas and the holidays were one of the few times of pure joy and laughter for her and her family. They always walked around town, gazing at the lights and telling each other Christmas tales and stories about Santa Claus and whatnot. It was all so charming and reminded me a great deal of the holidays I used to spend with my grandparents. My grandpa had dressed up as Santa one year and sent me and my parents on a big scavenger hunt all over the house to find my presents. He had even written clues and hidden them all over the place and made quite the game out of it. These memories, along with the stories that Harper were telling me, started tugging on my heartstrings, and soon my emotions and tears had begun swelling up inside. I resisted them though, determined to stay strong and not let the situation get the best of me. Harper stopped talking and looked back at me as if she could sense the feelings coming up inside. "What about you? What's your name and story?" she asked very matter-of-factly. "Oh, I'm Elliot. I just moved here for my business a few months ago," I responded blankly. "Ah yes, I remember them talking about that on the radio. From what I hear around, you're doing a lot of good work and a lot of good things for this town. People seem to be glad that you're here," she said to me, a small grin beginning to stretch across her face. "Well, I do what I can," I retorted. "What about you, though? Are you glad to be here?" Harper asked inquisitively. I looked at her dumbfoundedly for a moment. She certainly had a strong sense about people, probably owing to her transition to the other side of the mortal coil. I thought about lying to her and avoiding the truth. She'd probably know if I was lying, though, and what would be the point? She was dead, and she couldn't really talk to anybody. I looked around, making sure no one was watching us. I couldn't be seen talking to people that weren't there. When I was sure nobody was watching, I turned back to her. The air was getting colder as the sun continued to set, but the more I talked to Harper, the less I noticed it. I don't know, I moved here, hoping it would bring back some of the spark, I guess. It's been missing from my life for a long time. It's been a long time since I've felt any real joy or even felt alive. I guess you can't run away from feelings like that, though. They follow you no matter where you go, no matter how far you go, I confessed, feeling a little bit better inside as I did. I didn't have much of a social life outside my work, and therefore I hadn't had anyone to vent any of this out to in a long time. It felt good to be able to get it off my chest, even if it was to a ghost. "Yeah, I know what you mean," Harper said before looking back towards the town square. I could feel the longing and the sadness returning and radiating off of her. "I'm so sorry about what happened to you," I said, hoping my words would bring her some sort of comfort. She didn't look back at me as she responded. "Don't be. It's not your fault. You didn't even live here yet." Even though she was dead, I could still hear her desperately fighting back tears as memories of that horrible day probably filled her head. She continued. "I still see her. My sister. Our mom moved away a few years ago, so I don't see her anymore. But I see my sister Trish from time to time. She doesn't come by here much, which isn't surprising, and every time she does come by, she always looks sad. Like it hurts her to even look at this corner. She's always got her son Carson with her, too. I miss that little boy. He was the cutest little baby I'd ever seen." Harper continued to talk, a torrent of memories and stories about her sister gushing out of her. I listened intently, not even paying attention to the chilly sting in the air. I told her my story as well, about my grandpa and how I had first learned I could talk to ghosts. She also listened intently, probably happy to have somebody to talk to after so many months of silence. I was so engrossed by our conversation that I hadn't noticed that the sun had completely set until the streetlights came on right above us. It had begun to snow lightly, covering the street and the sidewalk in a fine layer of sugary white powder. We hadn't had snow all winter long yet, so it was a welcome sight, even in this harsh cold. Harper finished another story about her and her sister, then looked around, taking in the scene the same as I was. I could feel the tiny smile begin to unfold its way out of my mouth, and I looked over at Harper to see the same thing. I still couldn't believe that any of this was happening. Me, sitting here with a ghost, both of us in total amazement of the snow and the scenery around us. I was sure that in that moment, that this is what it felt like to live in a fairy tale. I looked back down at my hands to see that I was shivering. And I looked over at the town square, and I could see from where I was sitting that the coffee shop I had been heading to had closed for the night. Looked at my watch and saw that it was almost 6 p.m. I had been sitting there, talking to Harper for over 2 hours. Harper looked over at me and saw that my hands were shivering. "You've been out here a while. You should probably head back home soon and warm up," she said, the melancholy already beginning to fill her voice again. I looked at her and thought to myself for a few minutes. As creeped out as I had been in the very beginning, I had so thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and it was saddening that it had to come to an end. I thought about what would happen once I left. Harper would be left here alone, to simply stare off into the distance as the rest of the world went on around her, unaware that she was even there. I can't imagine how lonely it must be, to sit here day after day and watch everyone pass you by, completely oblivious that you even exist, I said to her, doing whatever I could to bring her some sort of comfort. "It's not much different than when I was alive, to be honest," she responded, looking away from me again as she spoke. "I was just kind of here, just floating by." "I'm sure that's not true at all. I'm sure your sister misses you, your nephew too, your mom. Trust me, there's so many more people that will miss you when you're gone than you will ever know. I learned that the hard way," I said as my hands went instinctively to my wrists, my fingers running over the bumps and scars that ran up and down them. "Why aren't you with your family?" Harper asked me with heavy emphasis on that last part. "My mom passed away when I was in high school. She had this massive heart attack in her sleep. My dad and I just grew apart after that and haven't seen much of each other since. He travels a lot for work though, so we don't get to spend holidays together much. I miss him though, and I wish I saw more of him. I think I remind him of my mom too much, and it hurts him to be around me," I said as I tried to keep the tears at bay, but it was too late. One came trickling down my face and began to freeze almost immediately. I wiped it away and looked away from Harper for a second, trying to regain my composure. I looked back and finished talking. "I'm not particularly close with my other family, and my grandparents died a long time ago, so I don't have anybody to spend these times with, really. I'm usually so busy it doesn't bother me, but with each passing year, it gets a little harder." I choked up at that last part, my thoughts racing back to dark memories. I know what it feels like to be alone, to feel as if no one else is watching you, if no one else can hear you, to feel trapped in the same spot on a loop for the rest of eternity. I wish there was something I could do for you. Harper looked down at her feet, then back at me. "Maybe there is," she said softly. "What?" I asked, curious about what she could possibly mean. "I told you my sister still lives in town. The day I died, we had this horrible, nasty fight. I can't even remember what it was about. I was so mad, I told her that she was never going to see me again. I stormed out of her house and all the way down here. I wasn't paying attention to the road because I was so mad, and I didn't see the car that ran me over." Tears began streaming down her face as she recounted the story to me. "I'll never be able to take that back. I'll never be able to take back what I said. And I'll never be able to tell her that I'm sorry. I need your help to make that right," she told me, looking deep into my eyes as if she were pleading with her very soul. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, puzzled how I could help her with any of this. "Just tell my sister I'm sorry, and that I love her, and tell her I didn't mean what I said, and tell her that I love her and Carson and I wish I could see them again," she said, that desperation from before now back in full force. I sat there not sure of how to respond. I was just supposed to show up at the house of somebody I'd never met and tell them that their dead sister told me to tell you that she's sorry? I knew there was no way I could do that, especially to somebody who had just lost a dear family member, and especially not on Christmas Eve. It was a perfect recipe for disaster. How am I supposed to talk to her about this? What if she doesn't believe me? What if she thinks I'm making fun of her or trying to hurt her? I asked, hoping Harper would see that this was a folly and would tell me to forget about it. But I could see it in her eyes that she wasn't going to give up so easily. "Tell her that you're a friend of mine. Say that you talked to me before the accident. Hell, tell her the truth. Trisha's a very open-minded person. She might believe you if you tell her honestly." Plus, you're a really nice guy, and I'm sure my sister will see that. I could feel myself blushing, and the temporary warmth spreading across my face felt good. I looked at Harper having a conversation with her sister in my head. I had no idea if she would even believe me or take me seriously, and I didn't want to upset her on what was surely going to be a tough day for her and her family. But I knew Harper wanted me to do this for her, and I didn't know if I had it in me to say no. I was already in way over my head, and since this madness had already gone this far, I figured I didn't have anything else left to lose. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but okay. I'll do it, I said to her. Harper's face lit up, and I could hear the joy return to her voice. You mean it? She asked intensely. I have no idea how I'm going to say this or what I'm going to do, but yeah, I'll do my best, I promise. I told her, though my voice was shaky and I was unsure of how well this plan was going to work. Harper smiled at me and leaned over and gave me a big hug. She felt so warm, and the scent of her perfume was so distinct. For a moment, I forgot she was even a ghost. As she pulled back, I looked at her intensely, trying to see something in her that told me that she wasn't. Besides her out-of-season attire, she looked and felt and breathed just like any other person. Harper then told me where her sister lived, and I made a mental note to not forget before I made it back to my car. I got up and dusted off some of the fallen snow off my coat and pants. I looked back at Harper one last time before leaving. I'm still not entirely sure that you're even here, and that I'm not just imagining all of this. But I'm really glad I met you, Harper. I'm glad that we got to talk. I admitted to her, hopefully not sounding like the cheap cliche I felt like. Me too, Elliot. I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it was like to even talk to another person. I thought I would spend the rest of eternity out here, doomed to watch the rest of the world pass on around me. And there you came. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for doing what you're about to do, she told me, tears welling up in her eyes again. As they fell from her eyes, they caught a little twinkle from the surrounding lights, and with the snow falling lightly around her, she looks like something right off a Christmas card. If I don't see you again, Harper, I hope you find your peace, or whatever it is you're still looking for. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Elliot, she said as I turned my head and started walking away towards the office. I was tempted to look behind me and see if she was still there, but the dropping temperature seemed to be pushing me even faster towards the car. I could hear the snow crunching underneath my feet as I turned the corner and walked past my office into the neighboring parking garage. I got into my car quickly and turned on the heat, and then just sat there, poring over the events of the day while I waited for my car to slowly heat up. As feeling began to return to my nearly frostbitten hands, I thought of how implausible this whole situation was. There was no way I was dreaming, yet nothing that had occurred in the past 3 hours made any sort of logical sense. There had to be a reason that this was all happening now. I thought about what Harper had said and what she wanted me to do. I was scared shitless as I thought about going up to this stranger's door, inviting myself in, and opening up all these painful wounds and memories that I had no right to open. I was so afraid that I was about to ruin this woman's life, but I made a promise to Harper, and I felt like I couldn't back out of it. Once the car was toasty and I had full sensation in my fingers again, I opened my phone and punched in the address Harper had given me. I then slowly pulled out of the parking garage and began heading towards my destination. I didn't pass the bus stop on my way out of the downtown district, so I didn't get a chance to see if Harper was still there or not. My GPS was taking me into a part of town I had never been into before, and soon I had no idea where I was going. The snow had by this point completely covered the ground, and I moved along at a snail's pace. Ever since I learned how to drive, memories of what had happened to my grandpa made me into a very safe and very slow driver, especially in bad weather. I took no chances as I maneuvered my way towards Trish's house. I was just starting to get lost in the maze of houses when my GPS told me that my destination was right ahead. I pulled over to the side of the road and parked the car. I was at the end of a cul-de-sac with only a single house straight ahead of me. This part of the neighborhood was a little ways into a grove of trees, so the house was nicely hidden from view for the most part. I could see that most of the lights were still on in the house. A string of multicolored lights was strung over the front porch, and several of those plastic candles were seen in both the upstairs and downstairs windows. The fallen snow had covered just about everything at this point, so the entire image was almost too picturesque. I got out of my car and began the long walk to the house. The driveway looked to be maybe a quarter-mile long. As I got closer to the house, I could see only one car parked outside under an awning on the right side of the house. The two-story home was almost exactly square-shaped, and I could see a chimney rising from the other side of the roof. The snow was getting deeper, and I could hear the loud crunching as I made my way up to the front porch. I got up to the front door and then paused, resisting the urge to knock at first. This is it, I said to myself. Once I knock on this door and it opens, there's no going back. Be sure you're doing the right thing. I hesitated again, before gathering enough strength to force my knuckles to knock on the door 3 times. I waited for a moment before contemplating knocking again. I was just raising my hand to the door when I heard the jiggling of the lock from behind, and moments later it swung open to reveal a woman about my height. I nearly gasped in astonishment. For with the exception of her jet black hair, she was almost a spitting image of her sister. She had the same half-tied ponytail hairstyle, the same small frame, even the same glasses. She was wearing a white house robe, which was untied to reveal her red silk pajamas underneath. She looked surprised to see me, but was otherwise warm and welcoming when she spoke. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked, her voice a bit deeper and louder than Harper's. I was still transfixed on how similar she looked to her sister that I didn't register her talking to me at first. She repeated herself, and this time I snapped out of it. "Yes, I'm so sorry to bother you at this late hour on Christmas Eve. You probably don't know me, but my name is Elliot. I moved here not that long ago, and I'm sure you're busy, and I promise I won't take up too much of your time, but I was wondering if I may speak with you, just for a few moments. It's important," I said, almost stumbling on my words as I tried my hardest not to sound creepy or suspicious. I wasn't doing a very good job because she looked at me conspicuously, studying me and trying to assess if I posed any threat to her. "About what?" she asked, in a curt and almost accusatory manner. I hesitated again, going over the conversation in my head for a moment before taking the plunge. "Well, it's a long story, but it's about your sister, Harper," I confessed. Trish did not expect this at all, apparently, because her whole demeanor changed in almost an instant. Her eyes got bigger, her mouth gaped open slightly. It was almost exactly how Harper had looked at me when she first realized I could see her, only not as exaggerated. She looked at me for a few seconds before finally speaking up. Yeah, sure. You want to come in?" she said, the suspicion and hesitation noticeable in her voice. I walked into the house and heard the door close behind me. Trish led me into the living room, which was connected directly into her kitchen. Toys were scattered all over the floor, and a large Christmas tree sat erected in the corner, more wrapped presents underneath. The whole rest of our house, while in shambles, was quite cozy and warm. I sat down on the sofa that was right next to a burning fireplace, while Trish went into the kitchen. She asked me if I wanted anything to drink or eat, and I politely declined. She must have just finished boiling water for tea when I arrived, because she sat down on the sofa next to me, a cup of steaming hot tea placed firmly in her hands. "Thank you for having me in your home. This is a nice place you have here. It's quaint, isolated, free," I said introspectively, my thoughts beginning to float away to other things. "Yeah, I like it here. Perfect place to raise my son. Not too far off the beaten path, but enough to where we both feel safe. Lord knows there's plenty I'd love to get away from out there," Trish said as she sipped her tea. I could hear her voice falter and knew her thoughts as well were beginning to drift away. "Yeah, Harper told me you had a son. Carson, right?" I asked. "Yeah, that's my boy. My little ray of sunshine," she beamed. "He asleep right now?" I asked, just now noticing his lack of presence. Yeah, once he eats, he's out like a lamp, especially on Christmas Eve, Trish said as she smiled to herself, some of the warmth beginning to return back to her voice. She then turned her head to face me and appeared to be studying me for a moment. So, you said you knew my sister? She asked bluntly. Yeah, I admitted. I did. I moved here just shortly before the accident, and I always had wished I had gotten to know her better. She, actually called me the day that it happened. She talked to me for a little while, and then she hung up, and I never saw her again. I said with as much integrity and emotion as I felt necessary. I had tried to rehearse the story in my head, but most of it was coming off the tip of my tongue, which I guess is better. As I spoke, I tried to study Trish's reaction, trying to gauge if she was buying it or not. She was naturally suspicious at first, but appeared to believe me as I went on. She told me about the fight that you guys had right before she left. This struck a nerve with Trish as her face dropped and she looked away for a moment before looking back. She looked like she was holding back tears at this point, and to be honest, I was too. I hadn't emotionally prepared for this, but I felt like I had to keep going. For Harper. She was crying. She was very upset. Not at you, but at herself. She told me that she said some horrible things to you, and she felt like she could never take them back. She said that she was sorry, and that she didn't mean any of it. Whatever strength Trish had that was keeping her back had given up, and she fell into her lap for a few moments, sobbing into her hands. I wasn't sure if I should reach over and comfort her or not, but the humanity in me prevailed, and I reached out my hand to grab her shoulder lightly. She reached over with one of her hands and laid it on top of mine. She brought up her face and used her robe to wipe the tears away from her eyes. You forgive me, I'm so sorry, she said apologetically. Oh no, I'm the one who's sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I probably shouldn't have come here, I said, trying to alleviate her in some way. She was already composing herself and drying off her face, though. I could tell she was trying to put on a strong front for me, but underneath I had unearthed some very deep wounds. I hated myself for doing this to this beautiful, innocent woman. I was ready to call it quits there and leave when she spoke up. No, you're fine, Elliot. I got a little caught up in my head there for a moment, I'm sorry. Trish ran her hands through her hair and looked off to the side as she continued. This will be the first Christmas without her. And our mom is out somewhere doing God knows what. Her voice broke at the end there. She began sobbing some more. She dried her face off again and composed herself. I'm so sorry for what happened. And I'm sorry for just coming over here like this and catching you off guard. I just felt like I had to come over and tell you in person. I just wanted you to know, I said, thinking back to Harper sitting on that bench all alone, just hoping I was doing the right thing. No, thank you for coming over, really, she told me, now catching me off guard. I wasn't expecting her to say anything like that. I honestly thought she'd be angry or inconsolable at this point. She caught my confusion and smiled and continued on. I felt so guilty ever since Harper died. Our last words to each other were just so awful and horrible, and I've gone to bed every single night since thinking that my sister died hating me, and that there was no way that I was ever going to change that. And then here you come along, she said, giggling to herself at the end there. She stared off, deep in thought. It was about a minute before she spoke up again. You believe in fate? She asked plainly, as if it were a question she asked everybody. This was a surprise, and I pondered over it for a second. I thought back to what had happened with my grandpa in the car, Harper at the bus stop, and now, this moment with Trish. I don't know. Before today I would have said no way in hell. But now, I have no fucking clue, I admitted. We both chuckled together, and as I turned to her and looked her in the eyes, I felt a shock go through my body. I was becoming increasingly encapsulated by this woman, and I felt I should probably be going soon before my emotions compromised my judgment. I should probably get going. Thank you again for your time. I hope I haven't wasted too much of it, I said softly as I got up from the sofa. Trish got up with me as well. You didn't at all. Thank you for coming over again. I know you said you didn't know, but I do believe in fate, Elliot, and I don't think it was an accident, you coming here like this, Trish confessed as she smiled at me. For the first time, I noticed just how striking she was, and how jealous I was over whoever Carson's dad was. I wished her a Merry Christmas, and she did the same. She followed me as I walked to the front door. Before I could get to the door, however, Trish slipped in front of me and blocked my way. This shocked me, and apparently it shocked her as well, because Trish looked like she was unsure of what she was about to say. So I hope this isn't too forward of me. Would you want to come out with me sometime? After the holidays, of course. She spoke with a fluttered tone, almost as if she were a young girl on the playground, finding love for the first time. I was once more taken aback. Wait, you're not married? I asked incredulously. Oh God, no. Turns out Carson's dad was a deadbeat, just like my own dad, she said bluntly, as if this fact no longer bothered her. Oh, well, that sucks, I'm sorry, I responded back. Yeah, it is what it is. But no, I'm not married, she said with a glint in her eye and a grin beginning to form across her mouth. Well, in that case, yeah. Would love to, I said without hesitation. We exchanged contact information, and I wished her a Merry Christmas once more. She opened the door for me and waved me goodbye as I crossed the threshold. As I looked back to my car, I turned around once more and waved, getting one last look at her face. The frosty air propelled her back inside, and soon I was back in my car. I turned on the engine and waited for my car to warm up again. I stared at Trish's house for a moment and then looked out into the forest. Even with all the warmth from Trish's house and the promise of whatever lay ahead with her, I still felt a heavy weight on my chest. The entire situation had gone better than I could have possibly hoped, and yet still there was something missing. I thought back to what Harper and I had discussed, and then to what Trish had just said a few minutes ago, and then it finally clicked. There was one last thing I had to do. I put my car in gear and drove off towards my home on the other side of town. The snow had tapered off some time while I was at Trish's, so there wasn't much more snow on the ground. Still, I drove with caution, but maybe with a bit more speed and push than I had before. I arrived home about 20 minutes later, and once I had locked the door behind me, I took off my coat and grabbed my phone out of the front pocket. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened up my contacts. My heart was racing as I punched in a name I hadn't called in a long time. I drew a single breath before hitting the dial button and waited as the phone rang. After 4 rings, someone finally picked up. Elliot? Hey, Dad, I said, my whole body trembling. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Elliot. How are you? My dad asked earnestly. I'm good, Dad, I said, resisting the urge to tell my dad about the events of the last few hours. It's not what this call was about. How's the business? He asked half-heartedly, probably sensing that there was a particular reason I called and was patiently waiting for me to get to it. It's going well. We're making the transition as smoothly as possible, and the town seems to be responding well to us being here, I chipped in, not wanting to brag or sound too pretentious. That's great. Sounds like you're doing a lot better now. Yeah, I guess so. It's good to hear from you, Elliot. Thanks for calling. I could hear the break in his voice, and it was all I could do to keep myself from getting teary-eyed. I had had enough of that for one night. Yeah, Dad, I'm sorry we haven't talked much this past year, or even since Mom died. I know we haven't been close lately, and I just wanted you to know that I love you, and I'm thankful for everything you and Mom did for me. I'm sorry for what happened last year, and what I tried to do. I'm sorry, Dad, I was so selfish, and I'll never be able to make up for any of that. Elliot, stop. My dad interrupted with a much more serious tone now. You don't have anything to be sorry about. I love you, Elliot, and all your mom and I ever wanted for you was for you to be smart and be happy, no matter what you chose to do in life. That's all I want. I'm just glad to hear your voice and to know that you're still alive and you're doing well. My dad spoke with a sincerity I had never heard from him before. I could feel the water running in my eyes and let a few more tears run down my face. I love you, Dad, and I miss you. Can I come see you tonight? It's Christmas, Elliot. Of course you can. You're always welcome here, son. Great. I'll see you in a few hours then. I'll be here. Take care of yourself and be careful. I'll see you when you get here, son. Thanks, Dad, I said, clicking the phone off. I sat there at the table, staring at my phone for about half an hour, thinking about the odyssey of a day I had just had. Ghosts, random strangers, ruminations about fate, and a reconciliation with my dad. I had not pictured any of these things happening when I had woke up that morning. But looking back at them all now, the path they laid out seemed so clear. I thought again about what Trish had said about fate, and then to what had happened all those years ago with my grandpa. So much had to happen to lead up to this day, yet none of it ever felt like a coincidence or a contrivance. It all felt natural. Supernatural, perhaps, but natural nonetheless. Illogical, yes, nonsensical, but natural. Everything happens for a reason. I don't know exactly why I have this gift, ability to see and communicate with the dead. My grandpa had it, sure, but it doesn't explain anything really. There is no explanation, I guess. Not really. Things are the way they are. And even if I knew why, I wouldn't change anything that happened. Nor would I even want to. I got up from the table and went upstairs to my bedroom and packed an overnight bag. After leaving some food out for my cat, I left and locked the door behind me. Then I was off. It was a 2.5-hour drive back to the city where my dad lived. But traffic was very light this Christmas Eve, and I made the trip in under 2 hours, even with my cautious driving. My dad was over the moon to see me, though he'd never admit it. It was just us that night, so we had a few drinks together and reminisced about better times. We both talked about Mom and felt the gap of her loss in the room that night. But we made the best of it, and by the end of the night, I was back asleep in my old bed for the first time in over a decade. I dreamed about my mother coming into my room that night, just like she did all those years ago, and telling me that everything was okay, and that she was always here, inside my dreams, whenever I needed her. When I left the next day, after treating my dad and myself to a home-cooked breakfast, I made promises to come see him again, and he gave me the same promise to come visit me as well. When I arrived back in town later that day, I drove towards my office and up the street to the bus stop. The town square was still completely deserted, with little of the fallen snow from last night disturbed. I looked over at the bus stop and wasn't too shocked to see that it was empty. No Harper, nothing but an empty bench and a bus sign. I looked for her for the next few days as I came and went from work. But to this day, I have not seen Harper since Christmas Eve. I suspect I never will, though. Trish and I went out shortly after New Year's Day, and we've been pretty much inseparable ever since. I fell in love with her and her son Carson pretty much from the very beginning, and I'm so thankful to have them both in my life now. She's sleeping soundly on the sofa downstairs as I finish writing this story. Carson and Dad are just down the hall, the two of them having passed out hours ago. I have never loved anyone like I love Trish. I think I'll ask her to marry me tomorrow. There may even be a ring under the tree for that very occasion. To Harper, the lonely ghost I met at a bus stop last year. Thank you for coming into my life and helping me find my family again. I hope wherever you are, You found your peace. I'll never be able to repay you for everything I now have because of you. And to my mom and grandpa, I love you and I miss you. And I hope to see you and grandma again someday. Finally, to everyone who's listened to or read this story, please enjoy the ones closest to you this holiday. Cherish these moments and every single other one until the very end. And never be ashamed of the things that make you different. Everything in this world happens for a reason, and all you can do is keep pushing yourself forward until you find your path. So to everybody out there, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and have a happy, happy New Year.